Thanks for joining us on Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you follow our social and political events closely, it's certainly more than a little bit disorienting on most days. The cacophony of political noise drowns out any meaningful signals. Sometimes the result is cynicism, sometimes disengagement, and on a good day, the struggle to find some historical context from which to view America in the 21st century is worth the effort. If you had to actually try and explain America to those outside the country today, it might focus the mind in new and meaningful ways. That's what my guest, Victor Wallis, did. And the result is his latest book, Democracy Denied, 5 Lectures on U.S. Politics. Victor Wallis is a professor in the liberal arts department at the Berklee College of Music. He was for 24 years the managing editor of Socialism and Democracy. He's the author of Red Green Revolution, which he's joined me to talk about in the past. And it is my pleasure to welcome Victor Wallis back to talk about Democracy Denied. Victor, thanks so much for joining us on Radio Who, What, Why.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. I want to talk first about how this book originated as a series of lectures that you were asked to do.
That's right, yes. I was invited to give these lectures in China, and I thought that the most useful thing I could do was to speak of things which, to my mind, in a way, are common knowledge in the United States, but would not necessarily be in China. Of course, I realized afterwards that the whole analysis is not common knowledge, it's controversial, but it was an opportunity for me to put together thoughts I've accumulated over the years, drawing on a lot of work by people who know much more about each particular thing than I do. But this was a great opportunity, really, to talk to people, to take a kind of overview of the situation, and especially to really show the urgency, the extreme nature of the situation that we're in now. I mean, it has the backdrop of the environmental crisis that I talked about in my previous book, but now superimposed on that, we have this unusual, to put it mildly, presidency, which has, in a way, culminated or brought to a climax a lot of tendencies which have been present throughout U.S. history and which now have reached an extremely dramatic form precisely at a moment when great changes are needed from in a positive direction, and whatever changes have been made recently are just being turned back instead. So we're at this terrible critical moment in our history, and I just wanted to convey that, and I want to convey that to an American audience as much as I did to anyone else.
And at some point, you certainly must have began to think about the idea that not only were these things not common knowledge in China where you were doing these lectures, but they weren't really common knowledge right here in the U.S.
Right. You might say that bits and pieces of it are well known to different sectors of the population in this country. So in that sense, each particular element of the story is, you can find it elsewhere, and I've tried to put in basic documentation to show people where they can find the information. But the putting it together, that's really the work of synthesis that I've tried to do.
How did you define these 5 areas that you wanted to focus on? Well,
I just began with the most obvious point, which seemed to me, especially for an audience in another country, which is the idea of American exceptionalism, which is the basic title of the first chapter. And there have been, as I cited in that chapter, other people who've talked about this in a critical way, because American exceptionalism is usually touted as the great, we're the greatest, to put it in sort of Trump-type terms. But there was already a book back in 1992 called We're Number One that presented a lot of statistics that were not at all flattering. And so it's somewhat in that tradition that there are many aspects of the way the system is organized in this country that represent, I would say, a kind of extreme form of capitalism, and that extreme and unrestrained. Perhaps the best known is the fact that we have the most expensive healthcare system, and yet among the industrialized countries, it's the one with it stands almost at the bottom in terms of outcomes. So there's a lot of other factors of that nature that people need to be aware of. And I think one that I especially wanted to bring out in this book is the way the elections work. and how there have been a succession of different ways of finding excuses to make it as hard as possible for poor people, typically people of color, to be able to vote. And if one way doesn't work, they'll do another way. And this goes way back in U.S. history.
Talk a little bit about the disconnect between some of these statistics, whether it's the amount of people that are incarcerated, the outcomes in the healthcare system, the voter suppression, all of these things, these internal aspects of America, as they are disconnected from the way in which we have traditionally projected American exceptionalism.
Right. I mean, well, the projection, involves the idea that the United States has some kind of moral authority to judge the human rights situation of countries around the world. That has been the basis, let's say the rhetorical basis on which the U.S. justifies its foreign interventions. Even now, we can see it going on right under our eyes in relation to Venezuela. The U.S. sets itself up as the kind of arbiter, while at the same time its own practices are problematic, to say the least. I mean, especially if you consider the whole idea of the free world and calling the U.S. the leader of the free world, and yet it's the country with by far the highest rate of incarceration, and the incarceration based on a system in which some 95% or so of the convictions are not based on a trial but on a plea bargain, and with all kinds of pressures that come to bear, and the whole social setting in which this mass incarceration has arisen. I mean, I talked about that in the book about this is a phenomenon that came in, especially in its extreme forms, starting in the 1970s, partly as a result of the reaction against the radical mobilizations of the 1960s, but also as a result of the economic deterioration that faced a lot of people as a result of the outsourcing of work and the U.S. relative decline compared to other great powers in the world economy after the early 70s. So there was a new kind of fear of rebellion, you might say, and the response was to, in a sense, establish a kind of pretext for police presence on a massive scale in the communities that were felt to be most likely seething with discontent, to keep them at bay. And as Nixon said, he was quoted as saying, I mentioned this in the book, we know that the problem is that of the blacks, but we must act not to make it seem as though that's the basis for it. And so you had the whole war on drugs and everything. So the thing is, you carry on policies with a kind of moralistic cover, and yet the underlying reason for it is to keep control, to keep a lid on, to instead of satisfying the needs of the population, to keep them from rebelling.
How do you square this history of American exceptionalism, this history of trying to take this moral high ground with this America First attitude that we see today?
Well, I think the moral high ground is part of the claims of being America First. I mean, of course, it's true that America First, just put in those terms, is a very sort of transparently selfish kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's associated with the idea of American greatness, and therefore America as having sort of a moral high ground. So that the things all fit together. And if you hear the kind of self-righteous tone that Mike Spence uses when he talks about Venezuela, although he's sort of laying down the law from this position as if he were a pope kind of thing, in the face of all the obvious, even open recognition that from John Bolton, National Security Advisor, that what the U.S. wants is the oil of Venezuela, and yet they're laying down this moral thing and about this the pose of humanitarianism in a context in which the U.S. has frozen some $30 billion of Venezuela's wealth and made them unable to buy stuff, and then they send $20 million worth of aid and try to make it seem as though that's based on humanitarian concern when they've been squeezing the country dry. But it's all justified with this kind of moral sort of lecturing disposition.
All of this feeds into really the second thing in the five things that you focus on in this book, and that is U.S. imperialism.
Right. Well, that's one of those words that is still excluded from as an analytic term from mainstream discourse. But how else are we to interpret a practice which regards it as legitimate to interfere on any pretext all over the world? It has 800-odd military bases around the world and passes judgment on the regimes of other countries and finds that if the regime is not to its satisfaction, it creates a pretext for going in there and overthrowing it. And that is pretty much in a direct line from the traditional imperialistic practices of the past. The only difference is that they don't completely take over the country and colonize it and establish a formal administration over it. But considering the scope, the worldwide scope of it, it's certainly on an equal plane. And certainly from a point of view of power relations, the idea of a power from another country, from the United States, imposing on other countries of the world regimes that the U.S. decide on, or at least attempting to do so, not necessarily always successfully, that's in the tradition quite directly of imperialism.
What impact do you think that globalization has had on how imperialism is looked at today?
I think that from the standpoint of people in the poorer countries, global south, what used to be called third world, it hasn't made any change. I mean, this is just neo-colonialism, as it's sometimes called. It just means that a greater portion of the economic activity of the major powers is international, but there's always been a component of that, right from the beginnings of capitalism. But certainly the ratio of its importance within the U.S. economy and the fact that the U.S. can ship so much of its manufacturing activities overseas and be so much tied in with overseas sources of goods and markets and labor. But what keeps the imperialistic aspect is the unequal power relations. The fact that there's definitely there's globalization, but there's definitely one component, what we call now the global north, that dominates the global south, and the U.S. is, of course, the most powerful player within the global north.
How much of that is due to economics? How much of it is about power politics on a more militaristic level?
I think the two are interrelated, the economics and politics, because the economic interest in having maximum access to different sources of supply and so on around the world, like most notably the petroleum, certainly is a factor, if not the factor, in dictating the geopolitical interest in having maximum control over those areas, whether it's in the Islamic world or whether now it's in South America. So there's very much an interrelation between the two. And which particular element is sort of uppermost in the mind of an immediate policymaker is, in a way, less important than recognizing that the two are definitely connected. So, for example, there's been, in recent years, really, especially under Obama, a huge increase in the U.S. military presence in Africa. Well, that's, in a way, part of the anticipation of any possible, what might seem from the U.S. government's point of view, to be a problem in that area, which would include threats to U.S. hegemony, threats to the freedom of operation of U.S. businesses in those areas, and so on. And of course, all this is becoming more acute now with the environmental crisis, because we're facing the prospect of shortages of land, shortages of agricultural land, shortages of water, and so on. And all this is a global phenomenon. So there's always this approach of maximizing one's access, maximizing one's control, and in the interest of being prepared for every possible eventuality. because the mentality of the dominant force in the United States is that, well, we do have an environmental crisis, but that means that we have to make sure that we come out okay. And so everything has become more urgent. The oil is going to be threatened, so we have to control all the oil we can and all the other factors as well. So the geopolitical and the economic are definitely tied together.
You gave these lectures in China. How much does the rise of China and its global influence, even in places like Africa, for example, how much does that change the equation as you see it?
Well, I think it does provide a bit of a counter. From the standpoint of countries within the global South, it provides a little bit of a basis for security against complete U.S. domination. Now, it's true that each of these other countries, including China, has its own interest in those areas, but it's operating on a different basis and is more oriented towards providing services and setting up manufacturing operations in collaboration with local people, and is not dependent on the military operation. But it's true that there is a global view on their part as well. But it's not based on any notion of militarily controlling distant areas. I mean, they'll apply military stuff in their immediate surrounding areas, but not on the other end of the globe. But they do have so function, say, for example, within the United Nations as a kind of offset or obstacle to some extent to the U.S. capacity to work its will entirely.
Certainly, Belt and Road is an effort to expand China's influence in many parts of the world. Yeah.
I mean, there's no question that China is expanding its influence, and I think that what's ultimately desirable is I like to think just as between people within a society, within countries on the global scale. I like to think of a relationship of equality ultimately. So my hope would be that the countries of the global South, which now at this point no longer in a sense includes China, would come up to a level where they can hold their own entirely. But I think that the type of relationship that China establishes with them is less completely domineering than the one that the U.S. does. So, and this is just whether that's because of limitations in their opportunity or whatever. And I think the question of what are the driving forces in China, it's still a somewhat open question, because they obviously have some accumulationist drives similar to that of capital, but at the same time, they do have at the government level the possibility of thinking in more long-term ways, hence their encouragement of solar energy, their reforestation programs, and so on. And to some extent, this kind of thinking can go into what they do in the countries of the global South. So, yes, they definitely have their interests, and I think that from the standpoint of the countries in the global South, there's a need to take advantage of whatever rivalries exist between the powers of the global North, and try to draw as much benefit as they can from it, but above all to develop their own capacities.
Do you think that that kind of pushback, what we see from China, that balance that you're talking about, or attempted balance, is fundamentally or in appreciable ways different than what we saw during the Cold War with the former Soviet Union?
That's an interesting question. I think it does seem to be comparable in terms of its impact. There's not so much, let's say, in the way of direct encouragement of revolutionary movements in the global South, but there is a kind of support. So yes, I do think it's comparable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but anyway, so that was another whole dimension of the book. But especially, I wanted to get back a little bit more to some of the domestic issues, because I think one of the things that I also tried to bring out is how the social relations within the United States find a parallel, and I drew the connection, which is well understood, been understood for centuries, between racism and imperialism, in terms of both the types of interest involved and the psychological attitudes that are encouraged. And so this aspect of domination is especially strong in the United States, and since racism was so much at the core of the way the United States society was initially established, with the introduction of slavery right from the start, which is sort of what I bring out at the beginning. It kind of becomes a kind of running theme through the book.
Mm-hmm. Talk about that thread, that nexus between racism and imperialism, because you weave them together in the book, and you weave them together as part of this story of the U.S.
Yeah, I think that where it became especially apparent, well, first of all, the expansion across the continental United States involving, you're wiping out whole Indian communities. And then almost when that period sort of came pretty much to a close at the end of the 19th century, right at that point, the U.S. started its overseas expansion. And the way it expanded into the Philippines, the kind of rhetoric that was used even to justify it, and the atrocities that were carried out, and the massacres on scales of hundreds of thousands, this was a kind of direct a direct link, because the Filipinos were regarded as just as subhuman, just the way the Indian population in the United States had been, and just the way really the African population that was brought over is treated as subhuman. So there's a kind of a seamless web in those things, and that's where you see the connection quite directly. And then of course the atomic bombing of Japan and the massacres that were carried out during the Korean War in the early 50s, and then again in Vietnam. I mean, millions of people killed in both those countries. I mean, just one of the things we often don't think of, and we're not reminded of in the current confrontation with North Korea, is to what extent the United States obliterated that country during the Korean War. And I think the ease with which that could be done does reflect some of the attitude of racial superiority, or I mean, it won't be articulated and phrased in that manner, but that it was easy to develop the corresponding attitudes on the part of those who were charged with carrying it out, and then now certainly more recently in the war in Iraq and the kind of contemptuous terms that were used to describe Arabs and so on. So it's an absolutely continuous thing, and it's in a way part of the training of the military to go into foreign countries and to view the people that they're going to be confronting there in a certain way. The racial tropes they're convenient. I mean, they enable a kind of desensitizing of the troops that are carrying out, which is a very anti-human thing for the troops themselves, and many of them suffer terrible mental consequences as a result of this. And as you know, there have been so many suicides of returning veterans, and they're forced into situations that are really quite inhuman. But it's an extreme application of a kind of racist mentality that here these are not even people, but when you're actually killing them, you realize that they are in fact people, and that they're not that different from yourself. And that's one of the big challenges to racism. But the racism requires you to instrumentalize other people, whether they're within your own country or in some foreign country.
The other part of it is the need to perpetuate those stereotypes in order to justify the history.
That's true, certainly. And you can say that this is one of the components of the current policy of setting up this kind of fear of people coming into this country from, in this case, Central America via Mexico. I mean, that it has a political role then. And of course, the thing is, we have a terrific conflict in this country because obviously not everybody thinks this way. But the point is that those who do think in those racist terms they're the ones who, in a way, they have a kind of upper hand in terms of policy, because it's given the economic agenda of the dominant groups that we talked about, the link between the economic and the geopolitical interests, it's convenient for those who want to implement that to have a racist mentality which they can draw on. And in the case of the immigration issue, it's very convenient because then you can have a whole set of people coming into the United States that are basically stripped of any kind of civil rights or power. They're totally powerless. And then on top of that, the sheer cruelty of the separation of children from their parents, which you have, say, on the scale of latest report I heard was at least 3,000 and possibly more, as a kind of systematic thing. I mean, it's hard to fathom that, how that fits into any kind of rational policy. But the only way I can even begin to explain it is by saying that it's a kind of effort to mobilize a certain chauvinistic sentiment in the country in support of an agenda which is not really to the benefit of the majority of people in this country at all, but they have to have some kind of target for their resentment. And that's, in a way, what's being done.
It's also a reflection of the way in which all of this that we've talked about, the American exceptionalism, the imperialism, the racism, has really defined itself in the context of modern-day politics.
Yeah, what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about it is that it is, however, also producing a reaction against it. And so you have it's on a small scale so far, but you have a new cohort of progressive politicians getting elected to Congress who are really challenging this head on. And this is an encouraging development. And I think the mere fact, for example, that since the last election, by most of the surveys I've heard of, that Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the United States. Whatever one can say about the details of his political perspective, what he's associated with is a critique of this vast inequality. And so the fact that this is striking a resonant chord among a lot of people is quite encouraging. But it's a real fight, and the thing is that everything is being done not only by the Trump people, but by the corporate Democrats to rein in this response, because you have this whole situation, which is what I talk about in the last part of my book, with the kind of symbiosis or mutual interest of the two dominant parties in keeping out certain kinds of challenge, and they do it in different ways. And in some ways, for some purposes, the approach taken by the top Democrats is a little bit less offensive than that of the top Republicans, and so it'll appeal to more people. But they both have in common maintaining the global position of the United States, and so the dissent is only very slight when you come to issues even like that of Venezuela, which is the one that's sort of in the forefront at the moment.
Given how deep the history of all of this is, then, is it realistic to think of any kind of change, even voiced by a small number of people at this point, of any kind of change in a dramatic way versus an incremental way?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. It reminds me of the question we had last time talking about the environment, because I said in response to that, well, it may not be realistic, but it's the only course possible. That it's so urgent to address the environmental change that we have to take a strong position. I think it's something similar in this sense that the level of let's say suffering that will be produced if there's not a change very soon and on a wide scale is going to increase dramatically. And actually, the two sets of issues converge, whether you're talking about imperialism or an environmental crisis, that because all the acts of foreign intervention and extension of the global economy and so on are precisely ways of not or practices that result in not addressing the environmental crisis. So we have to use a phrase that was coined by the French protesters in 1968, we have to be realistic and demand the impossible. And what that means is that if you continue with business as usual, it's going to you're never going to get the change you need. It's a change that has to happen on a wide scale, and I think especially that it's a change that depends not just on electing this or that other politician, but on the active awareness and on the part of masses of people who constitute an independent political force that doesn't have to depend on just having to choose between a Democrat and Republican. I mean, because that's the terrible kind of obstacle to constructive change that we've seen is the fact that by the mere shifting back and forth between these two parties, which at the basis have the same interests, this is going to keep us forever in this same situation. And so how to break out of it, that's in a way the big question that my book poses. And it's a very difficult one, and at least the first thing we have to do in order to respond to it is to be aware of how completely it embraces all the aspects of our political life, and to recognize what it is that we're up against if we want to create really what for ourselves and for the world as a whole would be a more democratic society.
Is there an effort then, and talk a little bit about the way in which you see it perhaps working, in that the environmental crisis, which has the level of urgency that it has, becomes the fulcrum for these other kinds of systemic changes that transcend the environmental issue, but as you say, there are common threads?
Yeah. No, I think it's very much it's a kind of potential unifying issue because it's like when you're faced in the midst of a hurricane, you don't care who the next person is, whoever it is. It's a fellow human being, and you're trying to help each other, and this is the situation we're in. So I think the environmental crisis does create the possibility of that kind of reaction. And of course, those who want to continue business as usual are doing everything possible to prevent that kind of solidarity and to erect walls, literally, between people and to stoke hostility. So yeah, it's a matter of each group that has its complaints needs to be able to express them, but needs to be able to recognize them as part of a larger configuration in which there's a kind of common interest of really humanity as a whole, and transcending borders against this continuous grasping aggressiveness and so on that is really now threatening our continued collective existence.
Victor Wallis. His new book is Democracy Denied, 5 lectures on U.S. politics. Victor, it is always a pleasure. I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's been fascinating. The time passed very quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.